In today's episode, we are going to focus on politics for a couple of reasons. There was a incident that happened earlier this week that honestly I'm still kind of shook about, and I want to talk it over with Ben and get his take on it. We had a larger incident at the Capitol the next day, and I'm also running for office. So politics is on my mind at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
one thing I feel like we should preface by saying it is January 10th, 2021, as we
wow.
record this. The way we're doing this, having kickstarted and then batched a bunch of episodes and planning to release as a season, we are in the unusual position, and in a way, it is the worst time to record the day or like 2 days after something of great historic consequence, because our takes are likely to seem absurd in like a month from now in some ways. Not the
Yeah.
larger grand scale, what is our philosophy takes, but certainly like it's interesting that,
Hmm.
you I don't know, like I feel like had we recorded a podcast on September 13th, 2001, we would have had a whole lot
Yeah.
uh we would have been missing a lot of the
Yeah.
implications of what had just transpired.
But I think that's sort of okay, right? I think highlighting when we're recording is good, but
Yeah. Yeah, no, I
when
mean, it's interesting. It's a snapshot, but
when the Easter Sunday attacks happened in Sri Lanka last year, was it? I was asked to be on a talk show for the Wharton School of Business. They have a, a show, and I definitely felt like, well, I don't know enough. This just happened. I don't have enough context. I am going to sound like a fool, right? Like
yeah.
in some sense. But I was sort of the best person they could access in that moment to give people at least some sense of what was going on.
Sure.
And later people would fill in and correct all of my mistakes. I mean, I think this is a kind of recurring theme in the podcast a little bit as we talk about social justice issues and how we engage with things. And I suppose it's something that I'd like to highlight. I think it's relevant in a lot of different ways that um, we have. We're having a dialogue right now about how we have these conversations, right? About cancel culture and about what happens when somebody missteps in public and says something that is potentially racist, sexist, etc., and how people respond to that. And sometimes there's like not enough response. Sometimes there's maybe an outsized response. And I don't know. I'm really interested in the meta conversation about how we do this, right?
Sure, sure. I mean, I think that's a little bit tangential. All I was saying was
Yeah.
future us may think quite. What caveat on the
Yeah.
package? This is recorded January 10th.
Yes.
Ben,
Okay.
it's probably going to be released in April. April Ben may think very differently. So check in with April Ben, because April Ben may well believe that January Ben has his head up his ass.
Yeah. It's actually not tangential. You'll see. It's going to circle right back around to that.
Okay,
But
sounds good.
yes.
Well,
So
I'm thinking of the Capitol. You're thinking of
yes,
the
I'm
other
thinking
thing.
about.
So let's start with the other thing.
Let's start with the other thing. So I have to give you guys a little context. So I live in Oak Park, Illinois, just outside Chicago. It is a very progressive town. When Hillary Clinton ran for office, I think something like ran for president. I think something like 90% of Oak Park voted for her. So to give you a sense of how blue we are, we're very blue. That said, there are Republicans in this town. There are Trump supporters in this town. And there are conservatives in this town, which are, not all the same thing, right? And there are people who consider themselves socially liberal but economically conservative, which I used to think was a thing. And for many years, so I understand why people would identify that way. And it took me a while
It is
to
at least a thing in people's heads.
it's a thing in people's heads. It has taken me a while to come to a place where I'm like, I don't think you actually can do that on a practical level, but I understand why people want to do that. So, and I'd say there are a lot of people here who are liberal and proudly liberal, and but not necessarily progressive, and that's sort of an interesting distinction. there's a place here called Live Cafe. It is walking distance from my house, about a 20-minute walk. It's in the heart of Oak Park on Oak Park Avenue, just south of Lake Street. It was started by Rashida Graham Washington, and she started it specifically as a place. It's a nonprofit cafe, is my understanding, that was started as a place to host community conversations. Um, as she sort of said when she was speaking last week, not everyone is going to be happy coming to a church for this kind of conversation, and but anyone can come into a coffee shop. And I thought that was a great framing. And she has opened up her cafe for all kinds of events. Some of the ones I've participated in when I wanted to do a fundraiser for Hurricane Maria, Puerto Rico relief, she let us use the space for free. We had a night of performances and raised a couple $1,000s. She does that kind of thing all the time. She also, we had a Women of Color Maker Fair for the holidays, where people can showcase their crafts and help get micro businesses off the ground. She hosted that. So it really is in many ways kind of has become, in just a few years, it's only been around 4 years, like the heart of the community. So Rashida is Black, and what happened on Tuesday is someone threw a brick at the door of Live, and wrapped around the brick was a note. And I'm not going to say the word, I'm going to say the N word, but it was written out on the note, and the note said, "No N words on the ballot." Um, so, which I think is, I want to highlight that this is specifically about Black people running for office,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It is not your garden variety racism. It was not just,
Pretty classic form of racism, but yeah.
yeah, but it was politically directed. And I think
Sure.
that's fascinating. And I wrote something, when I saw this, um, on the 5th, this is Tuesday the 5th, that this happened, in various Facebook groups, sort of tracing out what I would argue that this, I don't know necessarily what the person was thinking when they wrote that note and threw the brick, but to me it seems like it is of a piece with being a reaction to Stacey Abrams and her work in Georgia, mobilizing Black voters and flipping, 2 seats, um, and winning the House, winning the Senate. Well,
The
now
Senate.
I'm the Senate, winning the Senate. We
Senate.
already had the
Yeah.
House, right? So, and if you haven't figured out yet that I'm a Democrat, when I say we, I'm a Democrat. I'm not sure you could listen to this podcast for very long without figuring that out. But, and to be fair, the Democrats are probably not as progressive as I would like them to be. But
Yeah,
so,
I would say you could be confused on the. I mean, I don't know. Whatever.
yeah,
Anyway, go ahead.
yes.
Yes.
So,
Given the moment, given the
given
historical
the
moment.
moment, so I would say it's a reaction to Stacey Abrams. It's a reaction to losing the House previously. It's a reaction to Kamala Harris being Biden's VP, a Black Indian woman. It's probably even a reaction to Obama getting elected as
Sure.
president, because there are plenty of people who still think that that was not legitimate, right? So,
Well,
um,
I mean, yeah. I mean, they think it wasn't legitimate because he's Black. They
mhm,
like they have a lot of maybe some
yeah.
rhetoric around like some very very thinly veiled transparent like other reasons, but really that's why.
Yeah. So that's, I guess, I don't know. I wanted to kind of put out that this had happened, that in what I
Yeah.
think of as a pretty liberal bastion, it's a place I
Yeah.
moved to raise my mixed race kids,
Yeah.
where I could be bi and there's a strong queer, um, accepting vibe and organizational support and so on, where there are a lot of opportunities for women, that this can still happen. It felt terrible. I mean, it
Yeah,
just
it's terrifying.
felt incredibly bad, and in a way that I think is hard to I'm still parsing it days later. I wrote some stuff. I went to a vigil on Thursday night, and I was really glad the town turned out and the street was packed. They kept shouting at us, "You must social distance," um, as we're wearing our
Yeah.
masks out in the street, like trying to spread us out further and further. So we filled the block.
Yeah.
With support, and then but like the next day I was exhausted. I was like, I could barely do anything, and I
Yeah.
think this takes an emotional toll, especially I'm sure on Black people, but even on me as a brown person. There's a certain like reminder of the lack of safety. um
Mhm. It's meant to take an emotional toll.
yeah,
It's the purpose
right.
of the brick.
And I guess I kind of want to connect it a little bit as we shift towards um there's so many things I could say. Like I want us to link to Rashida's speech. She gave a really moving speech in response to this, in which I don't know how she does it, but she keeps calling for people to come and sit together. And she said something about how the fact that the person threw the brick meant that they didn't feel like they could come and say the things they wanted to say to her face.
Hmm.
And and I thought that was sort of a fascinating framing, that that's the way she thinks about it, that she created Live Cafe so that people could come and have these uncomfortable conversations
Hmm.
and say what they honestly thought, even if that was not necessarily socially going to go over well.
Yeah.
I don't know. I heard her say that and I was like, wow, I'm not sure I'm that good. Like that I
That
would,
good.
yeah, that after a thing like this to be like, you should come tell me what you think of me to my face, instead of throwing a brick. Okay, but I don't know.
It's pretty
Sorry, that
radical.
that wa- that was a lot of stuff, and I don't have anything super articulate, but I wanted to put that incident out there. Um, Say that I'm glad that the community seems to be coming together to support in response to this. There was a fundraiser that I think raised $20,000 in 3 days for the cafe. We have and then the other local thing is that we have three Black candidates running for village trustee, um, and not to get too far into local politics, but in the last election, due to a sequence of circumstances, we ended up with no Black trustees, out of a set of seven people for the first time in a long time. And Oak Park has historically been at the forefront of anti segregation efforts. Um,
Yeah.
um, in very concrete ways, when the surrounding region was experiencing white flight, Oak Parkers kind of took a stand against it and put in some really practical things that did, cost money and time, to try and be actively anti-racist.
Yeah.
So I don't know, it's interesting to connect it to WisCon. In one of the earlier episodes, I think we've talked about WisCon and its efforts in the science fiction community to have these difficult conversations.
Yeah.
And sometimes what happens is you become a target and a flashpoint, right?
Mhm.
So that people
Yeah.
will then be like, oh, I don't want to go to WisCon. They're always having social justice fights, right? That's
Yeah.
not going to be a pleasant place for me. And I hear that from people of color too.
Yeah.
And
Sure.
and
Sure.
what I would say in response is they have the fights because they're willing to bring things out into the open and talk about them. And I think
And if you're
if you,
getting it at second hand, you're getting only the. Of course, nobody
yeah.
is, spending a week after WisCon talking about how great the flimp was, right? Like, I mean, so, you know, there. Yes,
Mhm.
there's a.
Yeah, but like, well, but like if you go to Baycon instead, which happens the same weekend, and you could
Hmm.
in non-pandemic times,
Hmm.
it's not that they are free of racist incidents or sexist
Right.
incidents. It's
Right.
that
Right.
things are more likely to get shuffled under the rug there, right?
Yeah.
And so I feel like what happens at Live is similar. Rashida would rather, bring it out into the light and have the conversation.
Hmm.
But when you do that, I mean, she's not running for office,
Hmm.
but they threw this brick at her place of business because
Hmm.
she's a visible target, right?
Sure.
She
Yeah.
has a storefront.
Yep.
Um, which is heartbreaking. So the
Yeah.
three people, in case this airs in time, I will say that the three Black candidates running for village trustee, um, are Chibuke Enya, Shanta Griffin, and Anthony Clark. And I encourage you to look at their campaign websites and make up your own minds, but be aware that there are people really actively advocating against their holding office because they're Black, essentially.
Yeah.
To the extent of throwing a brick. Okay. That's
Sure.
okay. That's my like setup for all of this. And it makes me so upset. I'm tired now, so I'm not gonna like break down in tears at the moment, but
Yeah.
like I'm almost numb. But there's been a fair bit of that the last few days. Um,
Yeah.
all right. So the Capitol. Why don't you start us off on what happened at the
Well, we don't have to. I
Capitol?
mean, if you want to talk more about that, that's also. I mean, I
Well,
don't know.
I think we can weave back to, but
Okay.
sure. I don't know if you have any thoughts you want to throw in
No,
on that. Yeah, now that I've
I mean,
set
I
it up.
think the. Well, I think. I mean, that is. It is certainly of a piece with the Capitol. It is terrifying and makes me furious. Largely, fury is the appropriate response, and also it's like it's striking how like this is a 90% of the people voted for Clinton, but like
Hmm.
one asshole can have enormous power. All he needs is a brick and a piece of paper, right? That's
Hmm.
that's like, and of course he's the amount the bang for the buck there in terms of draining people's emotional like resources and disrupting and making them feel unsafe for a
Yeah.
brick and a piece of paper is a there's a lot of leverage in assholery, right? Like
Hmm.
there's a tremendous like it's conceivably just one person who's disturbed enough to do that in all of Oak Park, but they but they have that leverage, right? And that's because they have what is it, 500 years of or 400 years of state sanctioned violence against people of color behind them, right? Um,
Yeah.
but
Also, there's the problem, right? One of the problems is that when something like this happens, you would hope that what you'd get in reaction would be a positive reaction, but um, I think one thing that always happens is that when there's violence, people get scared for themselves, for their families, um, for their well being. And so then there's an impulse towards beefing up security. And that can be really dangerous, right? That,
yeah,
that often plays directly into the hands of the people who started the rioting or whatever it is in the violence in the first place, because it's I was reading an analysis recently about what happened in Sri Lanka over the last few elections, and it was very much that kind of sequence that here are these people, they put forward, they created some violence, the populace got scared, they elected people who were running on a security platform that
yeah,
led to more militarization in police. It ends up with electing the very people who started all of this, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. And I mean that is right. That is one of the natural advantages of
Mhm.
like of I'm not sure if the right is exactly the right term, but it's one of the natural advantages of like if if you have a an ideology based on fear of the other, getting everyone afraid of the other is probably to your advantage. So like there's a natural lean towards
Right.
violence.
Well, and this
I've been
is
having this
the
really
sorry.
no,
Uh,
I I have this ongoing conversation with my kids where about um uh, violence. And I mean, and it's kind of funny. I have many conversations with my kids where we're on the like where I don't know, like it's not predictable where our positions are based on the fact that I'm their dad, because I sort of they are very I appreciate that they are very clear. The Richard Spence, the punching Nazis thing, the
mhm.
meme, the like sort of somebody, Richard Spencer, a cleaned up Nazi with a nice tie, was giving an interview, and some Antifa person came and punched him in the head, to because that's their philosophy, is that you deplatform Nazis. And then there was like a lot of sort of discussion on social media about like, should you punch Nazis? And like, my position on should you punch Nazis is like, it depends, right? Like, it depends radically. And I mean, when I say it depends, I mean like, I'm talking like game designer, it depends.
Hmm.
Like, I don't know what exactly resources do you have and what's going on and what's the context. Like, this is one of the cards in your hand. Like, and it could
Yeah,
be a
it's interesting.
terrible idea.
I
It's
almost
often
wi-
a terrible idea.
I almost
But
wish that we had made Jed stay on for this because he's a pacifist, right?
yeah.
Um, so I think he would take a pretty firm position of no, never, never punch the Nazi because it's going
Well,
to.
my kids have the position never punch the Nazi, but I have enormous admiration for pacifists, and I feel like, functionally speaking, I am like, to date, a pacifist. I mean, the last time somebody was literally punching me in the head, which
Hmm.
was a few years ago, I was just laughing at them. Like, I mean, that was my natural instinctive reaction to being like head butted and kneed in the stomach and punched in the head was like, are you fucking kidding me? Like, seriously? Anyway, but uh so it's not like it's not like I'm going out looking for Nazis to fight. My natural inclination would be to sit down and talk to the Nazis. And that's the other thing I want to say is around the same time as the Richard Spencer thing, there was also this article about like this Nazi who, or like person grown up in this white supremacist movement, had gone to a liberal college in Florida with this, they're liberals, they're not going to show me, had sort of been exposed and shamed and isolated. And then this guy started inviting him over for Shabbos dinner. And like, he went to Shabbos dinner, and eventually he like they denazified him. He like saw the error of his ways. So it's like, should you punch Nazis? Maybe. Should you invite Nazis over to Shabbos dinner? Maybe. Like, that's what I mean. Like not like really it depends. Like, really it depends. But I have
Yeah.
trouble communicating this. Like, I have trouble, and I think we have a like, I think generally speaking, I grew up in a time in which punching Nazis was a terrible idea.
Hmm.
Like like during the 1970s, they
Hmm.
the Nazis and the Ku Klux Klan largely got like demobilized and fragmented, and partly because they were infiltrated by the FBI, like turned infighting and essentially had sort of lost street cred.
Hmm.
And at that point, like, if you were going to go skirmish with Nazis, the Nazis would love that. It'd be great PR for them. It'd be great publicity opportunity. Like, you know what I mean? Like, they were
Hmm.
sidelined, and laughing at them was far more effective, or like trying to calm them down, far more effective. But like, there's a moment in history, you know what I mean? Like, there's a
Yeah.
moment in history when it is actually, I mean, if you're, it's great to be a pacifist if you're like, do you know what I mean? Like, I'm not
Yeah.
saying that it's not. I mean, sometimes it's an effective strategy to be willing, like, being a pacifist is incredibly brave if by that you mean like, I'm going to be beaten
Yeah.
on the front lines and lie in a pool of blood, which is, I
Hmm.
like, Yasha Koach. But like, right? But I mean, there are also lots of. I was reading I heard an episode of Code Switch, a great podcast, where they were talking about, they were interviewing the guy who wrote this nonviolent direct action stuff will get you killed, who is which is a sort of a history by one of the people in the civil rights movement, the Freedom Riders, who were like, very much trained in disciplined nonviolent pacifists, but had a whole bunch of like older black guys they would stay with who had like guns in every corner and were like, all right, we're going to keep you
Hmm.
safe until the action, because the Klan's going to come and burn down the house and
Right.
we are going to shoot out the windows at them. Like, that is to say, it's one thing to be beaten
Yeah.
and bitten by dogs in front of cameras when that can help your movement. It's another thing to be ambushed and like murdered on the street at
Right.
night when it's not going to help your movement. Then maybe you should fight back. You know?
So I think so. I mean, okay, I have three things I'm going to try and throw in as responses. So this question about violence as a strategy, I think I first encountered in Frantz Fanon's *Wretched of the Earth*. So I would recommend that to anyone interested in this topic. That's what we read in grad school when we were talking about this stuff. So and this is the Saussure Barthes, the kind of like French um, post-structuralist. Sorry, grad school was a long
Yes,
time
they are
ago.
post-structuralists.
Post-structuralist writers and thinkers
Or maybe
who.
Saussure is a structuralist. Anyway,
Yeah,
I
that's
know
why I
what you
was
mean.
like, wait a minute, I need to lock this down because I start teaching tomorrow. But I'll figure it out,
Well,
and I will tell my
Google
students the
it
correct
between now and
thing.
tomorrow.
But the who were involved, a lot of them, in freedom struggles in Algeria, etc., so on, response to French Belgian colonialism, if I'm remembering right. They raised these real questions, and this is, you put that up against Dr. King and Gandhi, who kind of relied on a certain moral force and shame and PR efforts, again, to get beaten in front of the cameras, right? So that it has that larger
Yeah.
effect, and it was very strategic. I do think there is a pragmatic, strategic way of approaching these questions. I don't think that is where Jed comes out of,
No,
right?
well, that's
Like, I
fine.
think, no, but I
I
guess what
mean,
I'm saying is, like, when you have these conversations, I think it's useful to kind of say, like, okay, those of us over here, we are having a pragmatic, strategic conversation about, like, here are our goals of getting to a society free of racism. What are the tactics that will get us there most effectively? Um, and then, but over here is this other group that is just very firmly philosophically or emotionally committed to pacifism, right? And they're almost not, like, they're not engaging with the strategic question, right? Like,
well, no, I
they're
understand.
having
But
yeah.
I would say there's also, but I think it's actually a spectrum.
Hmm.
Um, I would say this. I mean, I have an inclination toward pacifism. I
Hmm.
have thought seriously about the question. It's one of those things where, in all intellectual honesty, I don't know that I could say that if I was in the Warsaw Ghetto,
Yeah.
I would not have, like, I think at that point I would shoot back, right? I'm not saying one should, I'm saying I would. And
Right.
actually, I think,
Right.
on the other hand, I think there's a tremendous power to having a principled position in pacifism. I did a lot of reading in the underground about the Underground Railroad at a certain
Hmm.
point, and the Quakers were really interesting. I mean, and they're, Levi Coffin is this interesting character who's, like, clearly by nature like a swashbuckling daredevil and just wants to stir up shit, but he's a
Hmm.
pacifist, which is an interesting
Right.
constraint. He's also in a very privileged position because he's a white abolitionist, but, like, it's a great source of power to have set of principles. And there's not, but I would say it's like, I admire. We talked last time, we had a little meeting about my Shabbos practice, like what I do on
Mm.
Saturday and what I don't do on Saturday, which is, I have a specific structure. It's not as rigid and carefully, it's more fuzzy than what the Orthodox have. I really like hanging out with the Orthodox on Shabbos. I really like hanging out with Orthodox Jews who are like, "Dup, the lights go out." You know what I mean? Like, this is
Yeah.
Shabbos. It has these things. That's great. I love it when people commit to structures. Also, like, I'm monogamous, right?
Mhm.
Like, it's fine to be like, I've decided this is my structure. There's an enormous strength of source of power
Right.
to be able to lean on. Like, I have made this commitment. So, like, if you're going to take a vow of pacifism is a great thing, like a vow of
Mhm.
anything else that you decide this is the structure. If it matches you, I mean, obviously you can make yourself miserable vowing to adhere to something that doesn't correspond with you, but if it corresponds with you, right?
Mhm.
So that's one side of it. I would shoot back at the Nazis in the ghetto. You know what I mean? Like, that's me. Now, the
It's
other
interesting.
thing,
I
though, the
feel
reason
like
I say it's a spectrum, well,
yeah.
you want to
Finish.
jump in, or I only
No,
say
no,
it's why
go
a
go
spectrum?
ahead.
The reason I
Finish.
think it's a spectrum is, I am not, on the other hand, I think the other opposite of that, the other strand of that would be like, well, we need to beat the Nazis, and, like, whatever works. So pacifism, sure, let's try it. Or, well, I am actually not there. I'm not saying well, I am neutral on the topic of whether you should use violence, and I think that it just totally, like, let's evaluate. No, I think that there is a natural correspond. The reason nonviolent direct action is such a powerful strategy for the left is that, like I was saying before, there's a natural correlation between uh, if the ideology of fascism is to make everyone afraid of the other, and to glorify violence, and to believe that violence is the route to truth, and that might makes right, then every time you engage in violence, you are speaking their language. Like, there is a natural, and if in fact, what you believe is that there is a better society where we can all come together and share,
Mhm.
then every time you join hands and sing in the face of violence or whatever, you are demonstrating, you are showing a picture. The reason it's not just that, oh, it was a society that could be embarrassed, and, like, the reason that Gandhi and King's methods and everything were effective is because they were literally living a
Mhm.
picture of. You were like, well, what are you proposing? Watch, this is what we're proposing. And anyone is moved by seeing the moral courage of people who are willing to face down clubs. And but so
Or
there
even
is
in
an
Gandhi's case, like, willing to starve himself to death,
yeah, yeah,
sitting
yeah.
on the rooftop in full view of everyone so that his people would stop fighting each other, right? So,
Yes, yes, yes.
um
That's a very powerful way of shaming them. And in a way, it's like you are walking the walk. So there is a natural, it's not that it's neutral, there is a natural correspondence, a natural symmetry, a natural harmony between leftist ideals and nonviolent action and between fascism and street violence. Like, right? Like
yeah.
that's a so, but you know what? I don't know if Frodo would have made it through the 3 books without ever putting on the ring.
Well, I
Like
think
sometimes he puts on the ring and that actually helps them get away. And
that's
they would
so that I feel like that's gonna be a big segue because I think
All
it's
right.
unclear. I think Tolkien is kind of making the argument that, like, he does it in the moment, and it helps him get away, but it also directs Sauron's attention to them.
Yes,
Like it's so
yes.
there's
I
a
agree.
so
It
I don't
does, and
think
it
it's
drains his soul.
and
It
it drains his
makes
soul
him
and it makes it all
it
much more precarious,
And
right?
every time he does it, it gets harder to not do it the next time. It
Right.
exactly, it strengthens Sauron and weakens Frodo every time he puts in the ring. That's why I think it's a great analogy.
Well, it is a good
That's why I
analogy.
think
It's
it's a
just like
great analogy.
it's a big complicated. Yeah, yeah. I think
No, that's why I think
the
it's a
way you
great
were
analogy. It's
presenting it
like
initially seemed like it was okay. Anyway,
no, but what I'm
yes, I
saying
agree.
is
Yeah,
that's why I almost feel like it's a game design problem. It's like, well, if you're the playing Frodo,
yeah,
you want to use the ring as little as fucking possible because every time you do it strengthens Sauron. But you might find, okay, well, strategically, I kind of need to use it here because hell, otherwise I just game over if I don't use it here, which is actually I sort of feel like the attitude. Like I think that all else being equal, violence always hurts the left and helps the right, and sometimes. And I don't think it's off the table unless you decide to take a vow to put it off the table. But I don't know. I find it to judge
yeah,
people. I find that it's also very often you have small actors opposing. You have the first Intifada in the West Bank.
mm-hmm,
Israel is coming in with tanks and soldiers and crushing everything, and you have a couple kids throwing stones. And
yeah.
you literally hear this argument made of like, well, but they're throwing stones. See, that's violence. They shouldn't use violence. If they'd been really pacifist, and that kind of smugness drives me crazy, right? Like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean?
So I
Like
want to,
that's all right.
yes,
Anyway,
no, I want to, I have like 12 things. So I'm going to try and like
okay.
run through them. One of them is I want to reference a Star Trek novel that explores this issue for our readers. So Sandra Marshak and Myrna Culbreth wrote a book called The Prometheus Design that is about the cost of violence and callousness. Um, it's put in the context of aliens experimenting on us to solve some larger problem and treating us like lab rats. And um, and so it's a very different context for this same question, though, of if you let yourself do violence in the name of some greater good, we're gonna kill these cat rats in order to cure cancer, right? What are you doing to yourself in the process? How are you changing yourself? What is that costing you long term? It'll be slower to do it with computer modeling. Some more of you will die in the process, etc. And I don't know, it does a good job
This
of
was
laying
theoretical
out
when
the
you read the
arguments.
Star Trek novel, and possibly might feel a little less theoretical in 2021. The
Well,
analogy with the
I don't know that it was theoretical then either, but
I
well,
don't
but
know. I
okay.
mean, it's like,
Yeah.
yes, we're about to take a vaccine, and that theoretical
Yes.
moral problem was literally specifically like,
Yeah.
would you have waited for the computer models? What if that meant the vaccine
Yeah.
would have come in 2022?
I mean, that wasn't the issue though. We had plenty of volunteers to test on, right?
No, but
So,
first there had to be to make it sure that it was safe. It would have been unethical to
oh
administer
yeah,
them
yeah.
before
No, no. So,
doing
so in terms of like
sufficient
animal
tests to.
testing, yes, yes. No, I mean, but that's
That's
ongoing. I'm
pre-phase
I'm
one.
also a cancer survivor, right? So I have clearly benefited from much animal testing in my life. I probably would not be here if it were not for animal testing. So that's part of the cost. Okay, so that's
I mean,
one thing.
also animal testing is terrible, and I honestly think there's probably lots of low-hanging fruit where I think the rules should be
Yeah.
stricter and they should be not. I mean, I think there's zero. I don't think they are thinking about that cost. I think there's zero accounting for that cost, practically speaking. Like, I
I
don't
think it
think.
changes over time. It improves very slowly, but
Well, but I
I
mean, like,
wouldn't.
literally, like the people I know working at Roche and Novartis. I don't think that in their daily work when they go kill rats, I don't think there's like, well, I'm sure there's some like if it's monkeys, you know what I mean? Like I'm sure there's some level of ethical review, but I think there's at the moment it is very much like, well, if you could shave a day off the trial by killing 1,000 rats,
Mhm.
that's definitely considered
Well,
okay.
I think there's some people who like don't go into that business because they can't reconcile the ethics of it, right? And so that, in any
Yeah,
case, so that was one example. Two other things you mentioned, I wanted to be sure we didn't lose track of. One of them, you used the term deplatforming in reference to punching Nazis. So I kind of want to separate out, there are different ways to deplatform. Some are
sure.
physically violent, some are not physically violent. We are currently, right now, in a moment where Twitter has finally banned President Trump from
Yeah,
using Twitter,
right.
which is a very effective deplatforming. It is, I mean, you could argue it's a kind of verbal violence, but it's not physical violence. And I think
Sure.
silencing is a, it's a question that comes up a lot on college campuses where I teach. What happens when the campus Republicans invite somebody who most of the campus finds deeply upsetting, right? And where does that free speech conversation play out? Even if you're committed to free speech, does that mean that you are committed to spending student funds on somebody that most of the students object to you spending the funds on, right? So if you, it's one thing to say anyone can come onto campus and hand out flyers, but can anyone come onto campus with a bullhorn and stand right outside the LGBT center and shout homophobic stuff? And this is something that we're all struggling with. Like, I walked by that guy on the Berkeley campus, and he's out there with his megaphone every day, shouting terrible, terrible things. And I am not sure if I were in charge that I would be okay with allowing him to do that. I have a duty of care to my students, and when that comes against freedom of speech, it's a complicated question. So anyway, don't answer that yet. I want to just throw out the other thing, and then you can come back to
Sure.
whatever you want out of this. The third thing that you brought up, this question of, um, I think we were talking about security and about what was, you didn't say conservative, maybe Republican, or, but I wanted to bring out a distinction that I sometimes that I think is helpful. That when I think about conservatives and liberals, what I tend to think is conservatives usually frame things as, we have these things that are good and under attack, and we need to protect them. And that is why they have a leaning towards, law and order responses, bulking up security. It's why they're kind of vulnerable to people playing on, think of the children, think of the women, etc. There is a, and it's why people who have historically benefited from police protection, for example, don't understand why, spending more money on increasing police forces isn't seen as a general good, right? Because their experience is that the hegemonic forces of society have been on their side, and it's the, people outside society that are threatening the good things that they have. And my basic framing of liberal is people who look at the current situation and say, well, what we have could be better. And then their framing going forward is, here's the current situation. It is not serving this mass of people well, this society that we have. What could we do differently to serve them? And maybe progressive might be taking it one step further and saying, let us look at the most marginalized people and prioritize their welfare as we restructure things. And I kind of think of it as like, let's bring up the floor for everybody, and to connect it to science fiction, you're sort of aiming towards an Ian Banks culture universe where everyone, or some versions of Star Trek, right, where everyone has their base needs met in an idyllic, kind of way, and then, whatever happens beyond that, you can still gamble, you can still, try to become wildly popular, you can, whatever. There's ways that you can get to luxury and excess, if that's what you want. But you don't have to, you can do that knowing that your neighbors are not going hungry, right? And that your neighbors' kids get to go to school. So that then circles back around to this question of whether you can be, you know, socially liberal and economically conservative. In the end, I feel like it all comes back to money, And when I'm serving on a board or running for office, a lot of what I think about is, you know, the main power I have is to allocate money. And where I allocate it, budgets are moral documents. Where I allocate it says something about what kind of society I'm trying to build. Right. So, okay, that was a long thing. I threw a whole bunch of stuff out there.
I
Respond
mean,
to
it's very
whatever
funny,
of it
when
you
America
can.
is a strange system in a way, because there's
Mhm.
something strange about the first past the post regional two-party system. Well, you get these very odd. You have you the idea that there's two things, like
Mm,
there's thing A and thing B, and those are the two things, is very much reinforced by the specific rules of the American contest, right?
yeah.
And in a way that looks very odd if you're coming from like living in Switzerland in a multi-party parliamentary system, like
Mhm.
that's not how they think about it. You know what I mean?
Right.
Left and right and liberal and conservative are considered to be orthogonal here, right? Like those are
Here in
orthogonal
here
axes.
here in America, you mean?
Here in
Yeah,
Switzerland,
in
like
Switzerland.
in Switzerland, left versus right and liberal versus conservative are two. They're like this. They're two
Okay.
orthogonal axes. Like I mean, you know what I mean? Like so. I mean, most of the parties that call themselves liberal are more on the right in Switzerland.
Yeah. Yeah, no, yeah, the way I use the terms is definitely very
No, but
America
and
specific, but yeah.
I guess what I'm saying is I get the thing you're talking about, and I think there's a deep truth to it. And that's
Mhm.
sort of the small L liberal and the small C conservative of like we
Yes.
want to
Yeah,
the
no.
Burkean sort of we want to preserve what we have, and the sort of
Right.
but the guy who threw the brick through the window is absolutely not a conservative by that definition, right?
Mhm.
Like totally does not want to. Maybe he wants to return to some mythic pastoral past in which
Well, but
everyone
I
was
think
very
well,
polite.
you say he's not a conservative by that definition. I think he might think he is, right?
Maybe. I mean, maybe, but
Right,
yes, you might think he is.
because
But
he's
that's partly because
responding.
the terms in America, liberal and conservative, are almost like they're almost like mutual insults. Do you know what I mean? It's like there's not a lot of
Yeah.
Of course,
I mean
conservative.
I mean
He knows conservative is the name of his team,
Right.
probably.
No, I mean, when I use those terms, I mean, I use them in part because I'm trying, in some sense, not to attach moral judgments to the terms themselves,
No, I
right?
understand what you mean.
Because I'm taking it into the classroom where some of my students are going to be conservative and some are going to be liberal, and some will be Republican and some will be Democrat, and they maybe
Yeah,
at
I
age
get what you're
18
saying.
have
What I'm
not
saying is,
thought this through.
well,
But yeah,
right, but but yes, and that's why I say, like, it
yeah,
is useful to note
right.
that the guys who went to the Capitol hoping the Bugaloo would happen and the world would be
Mm,
drenched in fire and everybody, it would be finally time to get out your gun and show what a man you were by killing the other guy. And they're
right.
excited about that. That is not the Burkean model of we have a
No,
harmonious thing and we don't want to change it too quickly because we everything is in harmony and
yeah,
we must be careful to change not too fast and respect the organic harmony between our different traditions and the role of the
right.
no, these
Let me.
guys want to burn the shit out of everything,
I'm
and
gonna
that is a
pause.
different group. Yeah,
I'm going to pause only to define Burkean because you keep using it. So
yeah, okay,
Ben is referring to Edmund Burke, who's sometimes called, I think,
yeah,
the father of modern republicanism, and he was a member of the British Parliament who, looked at what was happening with the Revolutionary War in France, and he wrote this text, "Reflections on the Revolution in France," which I teach in my post-colonial lit class, where he has a lot of this kind of metaphorical language about tradition and loyalty and the value of the aristocracy, and change happening very fast leads to chaos and violence and destruction. So he is a conservative and a Republican. I mean, like a, as I said, like the father of modern republicanism, um, and it is not
Well, I mean,
advocating.
he wouldn't have said that because, of
Right,
course,
right, right, right. Well,
Republican for him meant getting rid of the king, which is the opposite of what he wanted.
right,
He's a
right,
monarchist, but anyway, yes, the
but
Republicans
yeah,
like him. The
the
Republican
Re-
Party in America likes him, sort
right,
of. I mean,
and
they don't even anymore. That's yes,
yeah,
Bob
that
Dole,
was
the Bob Dole
right.
Republican Party liked him. That's the point I'm
Yeah,
making, actually,
yeah, yeah,
is
yeah,
that the idea
right.
of well, of course we want to optimize for the common good, but we can't go too fast, and really we should preserve the independence of individual actors to,
Hmm.
but that is so, I mean, there's
Yeah.
conservatism in that sense. And then there's
Hmm.
actually liberalism, small l, the Economist, Wall Street Journal liberalism, which is when you were talking about, socially liberal and economically conservative, the government should be as small as possible. Everybody, what we trust
Hmm.
is individuals making voluntary contracts with one another. So them, a
Hmm.
nation of shopkeepers where they're going out and the government is sort of there just to be sort of a steward that everyone's playing fair, but really we shouldn't be like moving massive amount of money from one person to another because they should all be just the market will find the best solution for things if people are simply allowed to work with one another on the common
I
good.
wouldn't call that small L. That's neoliberalism, right? Like I wouldn't call that small
Okay,
L
well, I mean,
liberalism. Yeah,
in the okay, well,
right.
it's classical liberalism. It's not just
Okay.
neoliberalism.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, that Adam Smith was a liberal. That is what they mean by liberal in Switzerland when they say liberal in Switzerland. They mean that,
Oh, interesting. Okay.
which is
Yeah.
why it's a
Yeah.
right wing ideology. Now, on the other hand, it also
Okay.
is
So maybe economic liberalism would be
well,
that kind of thing. But yes.
I think that's sort of that that original instinct towards liberalism you can take in two directions because if you say, well, but wait, well, hold on a second, is it a nation of small shopkeepers where everyone has an
Hmm.
equal? Like if we like really according to that, you should first get rid of it, have 100% estate tax,
Hmm.
first of all redistribute the money and then say okay go right
Right.
and like right and I mean in a
Well,
sense
you
it's
also
like
probably shouldn't have a nation this big, right?
modern yeah, maybe modern liberalism. What Americans mean by liberal is taking that impulse and saying, but actually, we need constant intervention by the government in order to ensure that people are equal actors and that there is fairness among them.
Hmm.
Because in fact, you'll have predatory. Anyway, the 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 from a what I hope will happen, what you saw for a moment when they burned when they came when these people broke into the Capitol and beat a policeman to death. I don't
Hmm.
know actually the gender, a police officer. They beat a police officer to death, and they came with knives and bombs, and they terrified all of the people in Congress, the Republicans and the everything, because they've been
Right.
because the country's been told for months that there was a great steal and that they should stop it and they were going to
Hmm.
march on right. You know, if Mike Pence is sitting there very aware at this point, surely the scales have fallen from his eyes. That first of all, two things happened that day: the Faustian bargain that the statist conservative Republicans made, the ones who want the operations of capitalism to go on as they have been. They want low taxes. They want sort of there's an alliance there in the conservative wing of the Republican Party between the traditional Republican Party pre-Trump was like the bow tie Republicans who want low taxes and the evangelicals who want no abortion. Although interestingly, that's kind of funny because the history of that is really interesting because the Southern Baptist. There's a couple of podcasts I heard recently about the fact that around the time of Roe versus Wade, Southern evangelical Christians were fine with abortion. They had actually
Hmm.
voted in favor of, and what they
Hmm.
really were interested in is segregation academies, and that a lot of it really came out of this. And then they found that abortion was the saleable issue. But anyway, now most of them, that's history. But now most of them, they want a kind of uh, protection of their taboos around gender and sexuality, which they feel are threatened, right?
Right. Well, but I think that goes back to I guess I would just keep reframing it as like, here is a thing that we think is good that needs to be protected, right? So when Burke, it's really is where it's a very short thing, the Reflections of the Revolution in France. You know, when he is looking at what's happening in France and being appalled by the guillotining, et cetera, so on, what he invokes in response is this image of young Marie Antoinette as a girl who he met when she was a dauphiness. And he talks about her as essentially a star in the heavens, that her feet didn't touch the ground, that, she revolved, that revolution, she revolved above them, and that inspired people to more noble thoughts. And this, so when you, I don't know. I guess what I'm saying is, if you take a Victorian framing of, women are, you have that whole virgin whore dynamic, right? But the women who are virginal, who are up on those pedestals, inspiring you to goodness, like when you say that's what they see as threatened, right? It's something that they have a strong, protective, emotional response to. And
Well,
I
and fetuses. I mean, like obviously the big strong emotional protective response is like you're killing babies.
right, right,
That's the
and
real. That's what turned out to be a really good sales argument.
yes, but and there's this concept of like the designated victim, right? Which is that, it's useful in politics to have a designated victim that you can point to and be like, oh, this group is under threat, therefore we must do blah. And it used to be women, and then as women gained more power, that became less effective and it became children. So there was
Sure.
a sort
Think
of
of the
cultural
children.
shift anyway. And this is why women get sort of, nations get identified with women, and you'll see cartoonists that will, they draw Britannia as a woman, right? And there's like a cartoon um, I teach in which you have Britannia protecting fragile Ireland, a strong woman with a
Sure.
sword with her arm around this fragile woman, and the
Although
Irish,
interestingly, for America, there's only Uncle Sam. No,
yeah,
Columbia never really took off. It's always Uncle Sam, the
Lady
iconography.
Liberty. So
Okay, sure.
yeah, right. There's
Fair
Lady
enough.
Liberty,
Uncle Sam
but
is
what I
more
was going to say in this
more known.
cartoon, it she's protecting Ireland from the Irishman, who is depicted as this baboon-like drunken ape that is violent, and this is why you can't let the Irish have the vote. This is
Right.
this is during that era. Um, so I guess, one thing I tell my students is to always be suspicious when someone is, trying to heat you up with an argument of protect the women, protect the children. But it's tough. I guess I want to acknowledge that it's tough because I understand that that strong protective urge is coming out of a good place, right? Like I
Sure.
also have the urge to protect the weak, right?
But
I'm the
yeah.
person, like, I don't know if I would punch a Nazi, but uh, no, I don't know. Like I've never been in a situation where I know what I would actually do in that moment, right? Like there's what you
Uh-huh.
decide you would do or you want to do, and then there's what you'd actually do. But I have been in multiple situations where someone was being physically threatened. I perceived them as being weaker than me, even though I'm 5 feet tall and not very strong. But in my head, I think I'm a giant. I think
Yeah.
so. Um, so in one case, it was an older woman, and there was a young man harassing her as we walked under an underpass, and it was sort of dark and a little scary,
Sure.
and she was several steps ahead of me, and without thinking, I interposed my body between her and the man, right? Like, eh, and as if I mean, she was probably bigger than me, but whatever. I think that's a good impulse. So I think when we have these
But I
conversations.
feel like I feel like when you talk about your conservatism, the defense of these things are under threat. Yeah, but except that's only tangentially is that emotion connected to Trump's base. Because I think there's another really deep natural human emotion, which I also sympathize with, which is
Mhm.
to see the world as corrupt and rigged against you and to want to burn it the fuck down. That is a different impulse. It is a
Yes.
different
Okay.
fundamental
So
emotional impulse, also one that I can empathize with, also one that's resides in every human. But
okay.
those aren't the guy with the horn sitting in the Capitol, that's not Mike Pence. Mike
So
Pence
okay,
wants to protect his wives and daughters and make sure that no harm comes to them, and yada yada,
yeah, yeah.
against the
So
clutches of the overweening federal government. That's not this guy. This guy, which is a lot of Trump's base, wants to burn everything the fuck down.
so I don't want to. So I want to. I'm going to break this.
Yeah.
Like I don't disagree with you on that, right? Like,
I
but
feel like
but.
that's the reason I'm harping on that is from a Swiss perspective.
Mhm.
What I'm really hoping happens now is that the FDP wing of the Republican Party splits from the SVP wing of the Republican Party. I live in it's weird that all these different
Mhm.
groups are patched into two parties, right? I
Right.
also wanted to say that about your Star Trek vision of the future. That's a vision of the future, but Star Trek's vision is not Le Guin's vision.
Right. 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 No. 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 I was gonna. I mean, I only brought that up because on an economic level, Star Trek and banks both assume that there's enough money for. Anyway,
But I
some
think there's a lot
versions
of
of
people on the
Star
left who
Trek,
are
but yeah.
repulsed by banks because there's and indeed in the banks in the culture novels there's also a certain
Mhm.
uneasiness about whether all of this collective agreement is good. And in the Dispossessed, there's a whole conversation. I mean, Shevik is like a dissident in Utopia.
Right.
But anyway, the thing is, like, I guess I'm just saying, um, uh, it's I wish there is a rhetorical usefulness on the left in saying they're all the same, right?
Yeah.
George Bush came out in defense of American
Mhm.
norms, and a lot of people on the left were like, "Oh, well, you reintroduced torture, so you suck too. So you're the same as Trump."
Right.
Which is like, yes, George Bush is in some ways worse than Trump, in other ways better. I don't know. They're
Right.
different. I wish we had a more sophisticated taxonomy
No,
of what was going on
I
the
think
right.
we're actually saying the same thing. I'm putting the emphasis in a different place. I guess I tend to start with this is the stuff that you conservative person have in common with the people who are rioting. And so that's the stuff that you're hearing them saying. This is why you're having a hard time separating yourself from them, is because they're hitting these same notes that you feel. However, right, like then the next question would be, where are the differences? And in fact, like um here, I have I almost feel like the corruption that sorry, it's hard to parse all of this. So this, because you threw a bunch of stuff in, and I'm not sure they're all on the same axis, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, this question of corruption, right, is one that comes up a lot in liberal circles around this when you have the question of like, why do poor black people and poor white people vote against their interests, right? This is the sort of you
I
know
do for white people voting against their interests, or
yes, both, right? Why do poor black people and poor white people
why do poor black?
often
Why is it that the left holds that poor black people vote against their interests?
because so
In what case would they be voting? I mean, they voted for, so
they
it was
vote
voting against their interest to vote for
so
Ossoff and
often they vote
Warnock.
against, well, okay, let me finish.
Go on.
So, as I was about to say, poor black people and poor white people often vote against their economic interests, um,
Go on.
because for a variety of reasons, or they choose not to vote. They don't go out and vote for their economic interests, right? is
Sure.
is probably what happens more often. And that, I would say, often comes out of this belief that the system is corrupt, the system is against them, the system, nothing they do is going to is going to have an effect that will improve the system enough to improve their lives. So why should they spend time and energy and hope on something that is going to let them down the way it did every other time for the last several hundred years, right? And that is a completely logical and internally consistent position, right? Like it's really reasonable that they would feel that way. Um, and maybe it's unfair that we go to them and say, this time it's going to be different. It's a little bit like Charlie Brown with Lucy and the football. Like, no, really, if you vote for my guy over here, he's going to change things, or she's going to change things. um, but that's I guess I wouldn't say that's just a problem of the conservative. I think that's a general um, overall issue among the disenfranchised that they that it's very difficult for them to believe that 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 taking political action will actually enfranchise them in any helpful way. So I guess I wanted to like take it off the liberal conservative axis in that sense. The burn it down thing, I guess I wanted to connect. Like I think only a very small percentage of the people who have given up faith in the system then go from there to, and I want to tear it all down. Um,
Really? I don't know. I feel like
yes.
I want to tear it all down is. I mean, so there's a recent poll where 45% of Republicans approve of the storming of the Capitol.
But I mean
That's
more
about
like,
Trump's base. That's about the people who in the primary. And the Republican Party has shifted. That's not 45% of what happened is new people have come in and a bunch of people have exited. So the Republican Party is not the Republican Party of 2004, right?
right,
This
right,
isn't
right. No, sure.
and and I think that the number of people, and I remember talking to a really good friend of mine, not really good friend of mine, a guy I know pretty well and I like a lot, at the time of Trump of Trump's first election, and I was trying to convince him not to vote for Trump,
Mhm.
and he was like understood all my arguments, was like, yeah,
Mhm.
I know, he's going to be a disaster. I was just sort of calmly presenting, like, but come on, and this and this and this. It's like, yeah, he's going to be a disaster. But it's like, yeah, it's not that I want him to actually govern. You know what I mean? But I
Mhm.
just want to see their faces when he wins. You know what I mean? I just want to
Yeah.
see all those smug guys on the TV who are always talking about how, like, you know, all these people who've, neglected us, ignored
Right.
us, and sound so right about it, sound so smart and so full of themselves. I just want to see them feel aghast and see the bottom of their stomachs dropped out the same way it has for me all the time. They never feel that. I want to feel them to feel that once. I think that was a huge part of Trump's appeal.
Right, right. No,
That's what I mean by burn
I
it all
don't
down. I don't
disagree.
literally mean burn every building down, but I mean like they
Okay, I
want to
thought you were.
see
I kind of thought
a
you were talking about
drastic.
that. So yeah.
I'm saying want. There's the impulse to preserve the system that we have, which is a conservative
Mhm.
impulse, and then there is a populist impulse to radically overthrow and totally which is on the left and the right.
Well, and that's on the left and the right, right? So this
Sure.
is part of what you got to kind of we do have to kind of separate all this out, right? Like one of the aspects of elections that is so difficult is generally there is a big swing, right? Because everyone who was so if you I was reading what is the book? What happened? Hillary Clinton's one of her memoirs after the election, right? And one thing that really struck me in there were in some ways her losing was a perfect storm of many things coming together
Yep.
that got in the way of her being elected. But one major factor was that generally we switch parties, right? Every 8 years or so. There are exceptions, there are whatevers, but
What do you guys? We
overall
switch parties.
we swing. We swing from
That's a very small number of people now. America's super partisan divided, and there's very few people. There's a couple
no,
of
no, no,
people in
no,
a
no, no, no,
few
no, no.
states
I
who
don't
go
mean
from one to the other.
individuals.
What do you
You
mean
you
by
misunderstand me.
what do
I
you
mean
mean
like
by we switch parties?
the
Oh,
election
oh, oh,
goes
oh,
from
it's oh,
Democrat
okay,
to
yeah. One
Republican to
party wins, and
Democrat to
then the other party
Republican,
wins.
right? Because and this
Yeah,
is it's going to be hard to avoid because the
that's
people
also a
who are
feature, not a bug. But
motivated to change are the ones who are dissatisfied under the current government, so they get
sure,
exercised,
yeah,
they
yeah,
they get activated, and then they go out.
sure.
So that's always, so now Biden has been elected. I hope that we have a Democrat win in 4 years. They will have a little bit of extra weight pushing against them because there's a Democrat in power now, right?
I mean
Um,
that's usually. I mean, well, I
and
my
so,
impression is that the worst time is the first midterm. So it's like
yeah,
2 years from now is when
right,
there's
right.
usually a big reaction. 4 years from now, there's actually a big advantage to the incumbent. So like it's a rare president who only gets one term. I mean, Trump getting one term is a
Right, right. No,
significant failure.
if Biden runs again, he gets an
Oh, if Biden
advantage
runs
as
again, right? You're saying
as an incumbent.
if Biden retires, then
Yeah,
it'll be interesting to see to what
or
extent.
or let's say he does 2 terms, but 8 years from now,
Yeah,
it's going to
after 8 years,
be
it's quite hard.
it's
You
very
have to
hard,
be
right?
a
And so
hugely popular president to
So,
get
but
it.
I guess I wanted to separate out the burn it down in part because I don't. I agree with you. Like I think on a fundamental level, I would love to see the Republican Party split. I think most of the conservatives I know are appalled by the
Yeah.
violent
Right.
Republicans, right? And, when I was talking to my students, when Trump was running for office, one of the things I said was that, as the field of candidates narrowed and it became clear that it was going to be Trump, I was like, I'm so sorry. Like, I felt bad for the Republicans in the room, right? I was like, this sucks for you that this is who you're left with, right? This can't be
I
what
mean, it depends on
you
who is in the
wanted,
room,
right?
because
Yeah, right.
there's a whole lot of people who there that Trump has a
Yeah,
very devoted
right.
base for whom, and I understand why. Like,
Yeah.
that is a different thing on offer. The people who are
Hmm.
excited about Trump are not excited about Romney or whatever, because, but like, you know, it is necessary at this particular historical moment to make a distinction between fascism and conservatism. There is a
Yeah.
risk in conservatism
Hmm.
of drifting toward fascism. There is an opportunity for fascists in conservatism, but they're not actually the same thing.
Yeah.
And like, what I act, it would, I am okay with I'm not a conservative. I'm a liberal. I would like
Mm.
the progressives to win, but I like that there are I think it's great that there are conservatives, but I don't think it's great that there are fascists. I think there's a
Right.
useful, interesting argument to be had with conservatives, and there's a vision of a Bidenian, a Biden's vision of the universe in which it can enrich the conversation for there to be people coming from different perspectives, bringing, maybe we
Hmm.
should tax a little less, maybe we should tax a little more, having that
Right.
conversation, working it out.
Right.
I still would like to
Maybe
see
states should have more power. Maybe states should have
yeah,
less.
exactly,
Yes.
decentralization versus centralization. Lots of interesting topics on
Hmm.
which should we have public private partnerships? I don't know. Like, there are lots of interesting things in which, like, I have my opinion, but there's an interesting discourse. I don't want to, like, exclude people who
Hmm.
think we should privatize things from a debate. I mean, I don't think we should, but that's a what I want to restore the idea of there being a center right party in America which offers, low cost. Now, it's been a long time
Yeah.
that the motivating force of that has partly been that party has partly rested its base on racism, on, increasing income inequality. Like, I'm not absolving I'm not saying that's a good vision, but I'm saying it's within the note. I like the idea of democratic norms and of that having a voice. And then there's fascism, which is increasingly has grabbed hold of I mean, it's a large number of
Hmm.
people. They were always there, but they were politically demobilized and fragmented for a while. And Trump, who's a buffoon and
Yeah.
couldn't organize a coup to save his life, which, literally, I mean, couldn't organize a coup to keep him out of jail. That's not a metaphor. But like, but like, but like, his great danger has been that he has been this rallying point and revivifying force where all these people who are naturally disengaged from politics, since they don't actually like
Right.
democracy, have, like, turned into a political force, and now we're kind of reaping the fruits of that. And like,
So I agree with you with all of
yeah,
that.
anyway,
I think it's just that I have a different focus. I think in that. So I'm going to tell you about one more local incident.
sure.
Uh, Maybe a month ago, um, there was we have a village trustee, one of seven, Dan Maroney, and a local villager commented in the comments on, I think it was the newspaper website, something where she called him a white supremacist. Um, he had uh, gone on in the wake of a bunch of other stuff that I'm not going to get into. He had gone on on a radio talk show that I would characterize as a white supremacist radio talk show,
Mhm.
right?
Sure.
Um, to get his message out. Whatever, I don't know what he was thinking. I think it was a terrible mistake. I think it lends credence and credibility to those people. He shouldn't have done it. I don't know him personally. I don't know what his views are. So I probably would not have called him a white supremacist, but I would have been comfortable, I think, saying he chose to go on this show, right?
Sure.
And aligned himself with these people to some
Yeah.
extent. So she made this comment. Several people liked it in the way of, message boards. Um, there is a local person, Matt Barron, who has done a lot of service for the community. He was on the library board. He's now on the school board, um, the high school board. He is, I think, friends probably with Dan Maroney because his response was to write a column for the paper. And as an individual, not in his capacity as school board member, but he wrote a column defending Dan and calling out the person who had called him a white supremacist, um,
Sure.
who happens to be Dima Ali is a Muslim woman, right?
Yeah.
And and that is not irrelevant because in his column he used a lot of language about if you see something, say something, and when
Wow.
right? Okay, so your response to that is a little bit of shock and upset, right? Like
Hmm.
he's like, and he used that, and he kind of talked about like the bag in the train station kind of thing as like where that's coming from, right? So
Yeah.
just in case anyone hadn't made that connection, he kind of made it, and
Wait, was
said
he
so when
saying
I
this in the context that she had seen a white supremacist like a bag in a train station
no,
and said something
no.
as she should?
So
Because
what
that
he
seems
was
like the
saying
natural,
is
the
that when he
natural core
sees
place to take that.
yeah, no, what he was saying was that he saw, a person in the community beating up on Dan Maroney essentially,
Oh,
and
I
he had
see.
to call
Poor
it
Dan
out.
Maroney.
Um,
Oh, okay.
right?
She's the
Yes.
bag in the station, not Dan
She's
Maroney.
a bag she's a bag in the station. This is obviously a huge problem. So there was then a backlash as Dima and many others pointed out that this was Islamophobic, this framing, and
Yep.
this, it's particularly problematic for someone on the school board who we have
Sure.
Muslim students. How are they going to feel safe and protected if
Right.
someone is going to use this kind of rhetorical framing and language? So the end result of all of this is that his term is going to be up. Or not that it's going to be yeah, his term is going to be up, and I think he's not running again if I'm remembering right. So otherwise I suspect there would have been some push to possibly have a recall election. He So I called and talked to him. I messaged him and I asked if he wanted to have a conversation about
Yeah.
this because I'm running for school board,
Sure.
for this particular school board, right? And so I felt like I wanted to hear his side of things before I took a public stand, etc. And I kind of feel like my take on it is not going to be um, firmly anti-racist enough for or like for some population. So
Uh-huh.
but I, I guess my take on it is I think about what Nalo Hopkinson, who's a science fiction Afro-Caribbean Canadian writer, told me at one point, that racism is a sea of shit that we're all swimming in, and if you
Right.
swim in shit, it's inevitable that some of it will stick to you.
Sure.
And I think the language that he reached for is part of that sea of shit, right?
Sure.
Um, he was not consciously trying to be Islamophobic in that moment. He was expressing probably something that came out of some ideas that had attached to him. And I think when I talked to Matt, he was pretty upset, I think, and also still did not quite understand um, that it was not just that he'd used unfortunate language without meaning to, but that unfortunate language probably reflected some ideas that he's been carrying around with him, right?
Hmm.
And I guess
That it was
that's
no accident that he had used the unfortunate language.
yes, right? That it's and so he got so he apologized.
Hmm.
He tried to apologize once, and people did not take it as an apology, and I think they
Hmm.
were right not to because he
Yeah.
didn't really understand what he was apologizing for,
Yeah. Right.
right?
Right.
Um, but
It's
I
part of the there's an art to apologies, and
right, it's not yeah, you
one
have to
aspect of the apology is to actually, yeah,
right.
like,
So I think he apologized. He did mean to apologize for the impact of his words. He once the metaphor was sort of explained
yeah,
to him and
yeah,
connected, he then was like, "Oh, I definitely do not want students to be feeling this, and that's
yeah,
I did not mean to use that kind of imagery."
right,
So that's good. That's
sure,
I'm glad that he got to that. But I do think there's probably still a ways to go. And the reason I went into this in some detail is A, it's like immediate and relevant. Um, B, I think it is. I keep thinking about the 70s and the consciousness raising groups of the time, right? I feel like we all have to do this work of, we talk about decolonizing ourselves, or I don't know what the word would be, deracinating ourselves, or that's not quite
Yeah,
right. But finding
dismantling
those bits of
white
shit that are
supremacy.
sticking to our brain, and burning them out, right? Like
Sure.
rooting them out. And it's a difficult and uncomfortable process. And this is um when Rashida Graham Washington is opening Live Cafe and asking people to come have those conversations. I feel like that's the work that she's engaged in, and that she's asking us to engage in. And I guess that's what I want Republicans to be doing right now, is like taking a really hard look at, like, what is it about republicanism that makes you a Republican? Like, what is it about your party that you actually believe in? And does your party stand for what you believe in, right? Are those policies that they're putting forward the policies you want to support? And I say this for the Democrats too, because I think the Democratic Party is not nearly as left as I would like it to be, right? So I think as Biden comes into office, you know, all the Democrats need to pivot to holding his feet to the fire, right? And, not letting
Yeah,
him
well, and
give in
I
to
also think
those
yeah, I mean that's an interesting, like
mollifying tendencies, right? So let's all get
what
along.
I mean, I don't know. I feel like people act like it's a zero. There's a lot of this
Yeah.
conversation, both in the should you talk to the guy who said the racist thing? I'm glad you called him, by the way, and also in the political conversation about like, well, should Biden listen to the squad or should he try to get Murkowski and Romney to sign on? And I kind of feel like um, it is an unfortunate aspect of the sort of political theater aspect of our worlds that turns that into a zero sum game. It's not
Mhm.
actually, that is an artificial thing. It is not actually a zero sum game. You know what I mean? Like, because, and part of that has to do with the fact that there is a distinction between people and their behavior, and it's a highly contextual thing. Like so one thing I would say is there is the work that everybody has to do of like understanding, the weight of history and deprogramming themselves from the bullshit. And
Mhm.
that is a conversation in which people can be engaged in. And I think it's not about like how much information they have. I was talking to my daughter about people at her school and conversations she's had, and sort of like people who are very much not aligned with her ideologically. You know, some person who a lot of people can't stand because their opinions are obnoxious, but who she has the feeling like, but this person really listens. This person is actually having a good faith conversation with me, and therefore it is not. You know what I mean? It's not like it's not. I don't. And that is somebody can have um, crap opinions and be like open and
Mhm.
acting in good faith and like having a dialogue, and that is great because it needs to be a really wide spectrum of people who are having a dialogue. And then there's a whole other thing if people are acting in bad faith. It is of course hard to tell if someone's acting in bad faith because that's you're making guesses about their intent. But but fascism specifically, not right wingness, not conservatism, not wanting to dismantle the welfare state, not all those things. Literally, just fascism poses a specific, unique problem to the idea of a discourse in which we all like marketplace of ideas learn from each other and get better at it. Because fascism specifically has an attitude toward language and thinking, which is
So let me
one
let
in
me
which, by design, one does not learn. You know what I
I have
mean?
I do,
Yes.
but I have a question for you. So when I ran for library board,
Yeah.
I asked various people for donations. One of them was George R. R. Martin, and George donated $500 to my campaign, but with a condition. And he said, I'll donate to you as long as you are committed to defending free speech, right? And I think there is a strong streak in science fiction of, especially the previous generation, perhaps, um, that sees the that thinks about the McCarthy era and sees threats to free speech similar to how you're framing fascism, as that it is a way of shutting down dialogue, that it
But when you
is
say threats to free speech, are you literally talking about the government regulating speech? You're talking about the
no, no,
First
no,
Amendment,
threats.
so the government regulating speech.
I'm talking about, I think what George is talking about, and I'm putting words in his mouth, I'd have to ask him to be certain, but I think he's pretty disturbed by cancel culture, by
I just find
um,
it so odd. Cancel culture is free speech. Saying you suck is free speech. Saying you said this thing I don't like and therefore I'm mad at you is free speech. I don't understand. Why does the person? So who gets first free speech? The person who goes first gets the free speech, and the second person doesn't get free speech because they don't get to say that the
well,
first
but I
person
think
sucks.
I think
Like what
that,
is
like, in the
what?
old days, you could have a back and forth with two or three people in the letter column of a magazine, right? And they
I
might,
mean, honestly, a lot of
it,
people who don't like
I think,
cancel culture, they don't like the internet. What they don't like is the
right.
internet.
No, no, that I would agree. I would agree that,
There
like,
was always
what
cancel
is,
culture.
yeah, yeah,
There has not been any shift in people being like, I am defended what you say and I think you should not. That's very
okay.
1950s. That's very
I, I,
1920s.
I'm like, I'm a little worried about who I'm aligning myself with here, but I'll just say I am disturbed by the tendency of the internet to fall on people's heads, right? I
I
do
think
find
that
that
I'm
troubling.
just sure. I don't think that has anything to do with cancel culture. I think that the internet, we don't know how to use the internet yet. The internet
Yeah.
is a
Yeah, no,
weird
I'd
new
agree.
disruptive force and it's doing all kinds of messed up things to dialogue. And one of those things is we need to learn a bunch of new etiquette and skills, one of which is I said something dumb and now instead of two people telling me it's dumb, 10,000 people are telling me it's dumb. And
Well,
I
and I got
feel
fired from my job, and do you know what I mean? Like, there
yeah,
are.
I mean, although honestly, like there's a moral panic about cancel culture. Who got fired from their job? Like
Mhm.
Louis C.K. masturbated in front of a bunch of coworkers without asking. Is that not a fireable offense? Like, I think people have this idea that you're going to get fired from your job because you made a mistake and then you tried to apologize, but it was too late. The mob had descended. I would like somebody to email me a case. Like, when did that? Because honestly, what I see is people doubling down. Like in lots of those
Mhm.
things we were talking about in
Yeah.
incidents in science fiction where somebody will make, but I constantly see people making mistakes, fucking up, and then going like, you know what? Sorry, fucked up. And then everybody lets it go. There is not a mob of harpies that will drive you out of your job. Like the people who are
Right,
getting
that
fired from
that
their
that
job.
goes back to the apology thing, right? Knowing how to apologize effectively, and I think that's something we're all learning, right? How do
And
you
I mean, I'm not saying
Yeah.
that if the people who
Yeah.
broke into the Capitol and beat a police officer to death apologized enough, they wouldn't lose their jobs. No, I think there are some things that are clearly beyond the pale. But like, you know, I mean, and also the people who are supposedly canceled are doing fine. Like Aziz Ansari, he had a
Mhm.
bad date where he was kind of a scumbag on a date. Somebody wrote about it in the spirit of like, we need to talk about this. Not calling him anything table, just being like, this is not like Harvey Weinstein. I want to talk about these gray areas in which the guy's
Yeah.
actually not doing anything terrible, but it's just kind of a fucked up reflects a fucked up way that men and women relate to each other in our culture. So I'm
Mhm.
using this as an example. People were mad at Aziz Ansari for a minute. He probably lost what, like 3 bookings? He's out doing comedy again. Why? You know what I mean? Like, who is getting? Margaret Cho had a great thing on a thing recently where
I
she
mean,
was like, comedy is great today because of cancel culture. Cancel
I
culture is improving stand up comedy enormously. I think that's true
yeah,
because
yeah.
you can't just say lazy shit. You have to actually think about what you're saying because
Mhm.
it's not like people are just like, oh, he said she was fat. Like, that's not, like, now you'll get clapback from that. The internet will fall on your head. You will probably not lose your job. You'll just be
Yeah.
excoriated. And the result of that is that people are funnier because they actually have to think of things that are not just lazy, dumbass shit to say.
I mean, I don't disagree. I don't know. Maybe I'm extending too much empathy to some people, I'm not sure, but I feel for people who say lazy dumbass shit, whatever, something slightly racist, something slightly sexist. They happen to draw the attention because of where they happen to say it. they
Yeah,
get an outsized response
sure.
compared to what it's they're saying the same thing that
Yep,
many people in their circle say all the time and
yep.
don't get called out on, right? And so
They
that
happen to stumbled into the limelight and the world
yeah, so
falls on their head.
there's a fundamental unfairness to
There
that
is a
that
distinction between
bothers
like a
me. Yeah.
professional entertainer doing that and somebody where
Right.
it's just like it's their Facebook or their blog post. Those are two different cases.
Right.
But yeah, like Ferris, what was the guy with the open source boob project? It's a perfect example of an early
Yes.
example that somebody was like, "What
Gosh,
if we
he's
all
one of
just could squeeze each other?" A man, a cis man, saying, "What if we could all just
so
squeeze each other's
he's one of my
boobs?"
I'm blanking on his name because I'm terrible with names. He's one of my former Clarion students. So
He was clearly a nice guy with a dumb idea. He did a dumbass thing, and the internet fell on his head. And the
yeah.
thing that when
Well,
I
and
looked at that,
it was also taken out of context, right? Because I can
sure,
totally imagine being at a con
yes,
party, coming up with
yes,
this, throwing it around,
yes,
and in my little group
yes.
of 20 people,
No, the
everyone
dumbass thing was
thinking it's
not having the
delightful.
conversation in the hallway
Yeah.
because it was probably he probably could check in, see everyone's facial
Yeah.
expression, and everybody was having a good time, and it was a
Right.
slightly risque thing we're sharing together as a funny idea. But then he naively went and put it on the internet where it was not
Right.
going to land like that on people, and people who didn't know
Right.
him and weren't there and didn't feel the vibe were going to feel. I mean, we actually don't know whether anyone in the hallway was uncomfortable. Also, I'd like to
Right.
say plenty of
We
people may
also
have been
don't know. No, no, and
plenty of
it's
people may have
that's
been
fair.
effectively playing along and seeming like they were having a good time and actually pretty triggered or confronted by it. But certainly once it's on the internet and you're shoving it into people's feed, and so the world fell on his head.
Mhm.
And and here's the thing. I am a big fan of empathy. I have empathy for everybody. I have empathy for the Nazis who stormed the Capitol. Empathy is cheap. I could write a story and be in their head and I could think
Yeah.
about how their dad yelled at them. I have no have empathy. Do not ration your I mean unless it's draining you,
You're right.
don't take care of yourself. But like, if you feel like having empathy for people, have empathy. Have lots of empathy. Poor Hitler. He was beaten as a boy. I don't know. I mean, for God's sake, Trump. You know what? Trump's father was a fucking psychopath. I mean, like, I have huge empathy for Trump. I have enormous empathy for Trump. Uh, and I mean, I know. I mean, Trump is a narcissist. It is a terrifying thing to be a narcissist. Being a narcissist. Here's Trump's world. He feels if in the minute that a lot of people are not giving him adulation and attention and rooting for him, the minute he goes off stage, he feels like he's dying. He feels like he's asphyxiating because it's like a bottomless black hole and like it's terrifying. He when they wouldn't let him go into rallies, he was dying. If he could get on a stage in front of and Trump, when those people took the Capitol and like told he must have been so happy. He must have because when he was a big shot real estate, he could like sexually harass people and whatever, but he didn't have a mob of people burning the I mean, breaking into the Capitol. That must have felt so much like finally being seen for a minute, and then it went away, and he hates
Right.
himself again. I have so much empathy for Trump. Empathy's great. Have lots of empathy, but the
But you actually can't let it drive policy perhaps and
I
who
mean,
you
no,
vote
you
for
you
and
you
yeah.
can, but here's the thing people don't get about
Yeah.
empathy. When people are acting badly, when you have empathy for an alcoholic,
Mm,
that does not mean you hand them a drink. Like, oh, it must
right.
really suck not to have alcohol.
Yeah, yeah.
Here, have a drink. That is not an effective use of empathy. Empathy might give you the It's the same thing as Trump and power. I have every bit of empathy for Trump, which is why I want him to have zero power because it's bad for him. I want Trump to lose all the elections, lose all of his platforms, and then get lots of probably lose all the people he currently has who he's probably terrorized, and then have some good friends who don't buy his bullshit at all. Like tell him like it is and require him to be better on an island somewhere. That would be great. I have no
Yeah,
empathy
yeah.
is great, but empathy does not mean let people do bad shit. The
Right.
best thing for people who do bad shit are in bad shape and you should stop them. You should set effective limits and take their power away. That is what empathy demands.
Right.
And like in the
And I
case of
yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
No, I agree. I guess I was just going to say I think I have a lot of conversations with locals about local political things
Yeah.
where um I'm trying to think how to frame this where we are not far apart on what we actually are aiming towards, right?
Yeah.
So
Right.
we are possibly disagreeing about methods, um, but but a lot of it is that we have different rhetorical frameworks about and how we think about things. And I'll just give you one example, right? When I was running for library board, the library had just decided to get rid of fines, and I wasn't part of that decision. I supported it, but I got asked about it a lot on the campaign trail, and frequently. Um, I was asked by older people who were distressed about it because they said fines are great. They teach fiscal responsibility. When my grandkid um, doesn't return their library book on time, it's a good opportunity to kind of like make a moral lesson about, well, now we have to take money out of your allowance because you were late
Yep.
about this, right? And they're not wrong about any of that, right? But what I would say to them in response is, I didn't say, well, it's not actually any part of the library's mission to teach your grandkid fiscal responsibility, which I could have said, but that's not
You could
that's sort
impose
of,
fines, yes.
but that's not really the point, right? The point is that the library's mission is to, get these books into people's hands, basically,
Yeah.
right? And fines are a regressive form of taxation in that they hit poor people harder than they hit wealthy people. The $5 fine that the person living in the nice house in River Forest doesn't notice,
It's a
essentially.
good lesson for their grandkids
Right.
because their
Uh,
grandkids' allowance is already $15. So, like,
yes,
they're just
exactly.
docking a
Right.
third of it.
That
But
five
that means like a missed
dollars
bus ride for the person who's struggling
Or
with it.
it's like, the single mom in the apartment building, who lives across the alley from me with two kids, who is already deciding between food and medicine, right?
Mhm.
Adding
Yeah.
$5 on top of that, what that
Yeah.
means is she's not going to return the books. They're going to, they're in the apartment somewhere. They didn't
Yeah.
get returned on time. The fines have accrued,
Right.
and she's going to stop taking her kids to the library. And
Right.
aren't those the people who we most want to have library access?
Hmm.
And the reason I'm telling this story is because, so I said basically that, and sometimes I talked about my students and the way that, when my upper middle class students missed a paper or a quiz or whatever, they were late with something, they would send me an email. They'd be at my office hours the next day. So sorry, how can I make this up, etc. And my working class kids would disappear, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they would
Yeah.
never contact me, and sometimes they'd just stop coming to class, and I had to go seek them out because there is a shame factor that
Hmm.
also comes in, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, sometimes I talk about that, but even if I only talked about that first example over and over and over and over on the campaign trail, that was enough to convince them of
Sure.
like that getting rid of fines was a good idea. No one had ever made the argument to them.
Yeah.
And so I guess, I get I understand the value of a strong public response. Like, I'm glad there was a strong public response to Matt's column, pointing out the Islamophobia. I'm glad that people wrote to the school board demanding that they do something about it. Like, I think that's all good. Um, and I think I would want a stronger apology, and not just an apology, but I would want to be clear and believe that he understood what he did and was never going to do anything about like that again before I would
Sure.
want to vote for him, right? If he were going to run again.
Yeah.
Um,
It's also okay
but
if there are. You're talking about the guy who went on the white supremacist show, or the guy who defended him.
the guy who defended him.
Right. Right.
But
Yeah.
the one who went on the white supremacist show, I have a whole nother set
Like,
of
it's
questions for
okay. There's
him. But yes,
consequences for action. You know what I mean? It's okay.
right,
That doesn't
yeah,
mean I have no empathy for you to say, like, yeah, maybe don't
yes,
go on a white supremacist show. That could have the consequence that you don't get elected.
right,
That's not. That's not.
right,
You know what I mean? I'm not consigning you to
yeah,
hell. I'm just saying that was a bad political choice, and you should probably pay for it at the ballot box. Like,
right,
that's how the
yeah,
game is played. Like,
yeah.
I don't
But I
know.
do
I
think
feel like, oh, yeah. So we have to. We should be heading towards wrapping up since
we're
I
gonna
got to
wrap
go
up.
in a minute. But let me just say,
Yeah. Final thoughts.
yeah, I think the thing I was gonna so the internet is one problem. I don't think the problem is cancel culture. I think it's the internet, and the internet is hard to understand because scale is weird. So
Right.
you relate a funny anecdote about some risque things you said in a hallway. All of a sudden, 10,000 people are posting. angry about sexism. That's a thing that can happen on the internet. And like, we had to learn to deal with the internet. And honestly, I thought that, by the way, that guy did a great job of like
Mhm.
shutting up, listening, trying to learn, be like, holy God, the internet is mad at me. But like, fine, right? That's okay. The internet's mad at you. You notice he wasn't canceled forever.
Right.
I'm sure
Right.
if he launched a science fiction magazine tomorrow, nobody would be like, I'm not going to ever, that's the open source boob guy. No, the thing is that, of course, everyone's mad at him, but you have to realize at that point, what you're doing is you're now hosting this conversation. You've done the stupid thing in the public view,
Mhm.
and all the people who've been carrying around all the pain about this for years, you've given them an example of it. They're going to come talk to you about it. That's a privilege. It's a
Yeah.
privilege to be yelled at by the internet, by all the people whose pain you've suddenly triggered, like you know. So, and
Okay, but
yeah,
that's
Ferret
I get.
Steinmetz, I think he did a pretty good job
I think he
in
actually did, and I think like
hosting that
we have
conversation.
examples. John Scalzi with
Yes,
his mess up on race fail also came back
sure.
well. You know,
And in general, I think that there is a real distinction between people and behavior, and I feel like it is it is a good practice to call people in. It is a good practice to hold them to high standards. It is a good practice not to enable people's flaws and faults, but to demand better of them. And that is in their interest. It is not like you are against them if you are
yeah,
like, that was racist bullshit and
right.
you need to apologize before you get to do thing X. That is being nice to them. I
I
wish we
agree,
would.
but I mean, I don't think it's. I guess I don't think it's fair. I mean, I think we have to do it anyway, but I feel bad that we throw that conversation at them when they haven't been educated in how to have these conversations. Like you and I have had 20 some years of going to
Yes,
WisCon
which is why
and
it is
right,
good practice when if you see somebody who's having a pile on, then like you did with the guy, you reach out
yeah,
and you go, "This is why that was bad. That's good. That's good." I mean, not if you're the person most targeted, it is not your job to do that emotional labor.
right,
But if you are in a position where you can be like, "Hey, confused person, let me help you out." That's great. Like, give
yeah,
them the guidepost. But that doesn't mean you can easily do that without apologizing or excusing for bad behavior. You never have to excuse someone's bad behavior to be a good ally to them.
yeah.
You can
I
just
agree.
hold them accountable and love them as a person and hold them accountable. Like, those aren't in contradiction. They're the same thing.
All right. I agree. And I think I think we should close this off because Ben
Yeah,
has to
I
go.
gotta go.
But I think we're hoping to pick this up next time. I actually want to do kind of like an episode about why you might want to run for office, what goes into campaigning, what goes into actually governing,
Yeah,
because there's a ton of stuff I didn't know 4 years ago that might be of
great.
interest to people. So yeah.